The early morning air carried the scent of gasoline and damp pavement as the first customers pulled into the lot of Sam's Gas and Grocery, a roadside convenience store that had stood for decades on the outskirts of town. The building itself was unremarkable: faded green signage, flickering fluorescent lights, and shelves stocked with the usual assortment of necessities. Truckers, farmhands, and locals all knew the place well, and for most, it was a routine stop on their way to somewhere else. Behind the counter, Howard Wilkes wiped down the register with slow, practiced movements, his gaze shifting to the old clock above the coffee station. The days blended together now, one indistinguishable from the next. He had inherited the store from his father years ago, but any dreams of expansion or improvement had long since faded. The store made just enough to keep the lights on, and Howard had resigned himself to the quiet monotony of his existence. Among the regulars was Earl Patterson, a retired factory worker who had lived in the same sagging house on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. Earl's morning routine was unshakable. He would shuffle into the store at exactly 7:15 a.m., pour himself a cup of the bitter coffee that had been sitting on the burner for hours, and purchase a few scratch-off lottery tickets. He would then lean against the counter, methodically scratching away at them with the edge of a coin, never appearing particularly hopeful or disappointed. Howard had watched this routine unfold nearly every day for years. That morning was no different. Earl entered the store, muttered a greeting, and followed his usual routine. The scratching of the tickets filled the quiet space between them as Howard restocked the cigarette display behind the counter. After a few moments, Earl let out a familiar sigh, crumpled the tickets in his fist, and tossed them into the small trash bin beside the register before taking his coffee and heading out the door. Howard barely noticed. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. A few truckers stopped in to refuel, a mother and her teenage son wandered the aisles searching for snacks, and an elderly couple debated over which brand of motor oil to buy. By noon, the flow of customers had slowed to its usual midday lull. Howard moved through his routine, wiping down the counter, rearranging candy bars near the register, and flipping idly through an old newspaper someone had left behind. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, as he was sweeping near the front counter, that he happened to glance down into the trash bin. Among the discarded receipts and empty sugar packets were the lottery tickets Earl had thrown away. Without much thought, Howard bent down, retrieved them, and straightened them out. He wasn't sure why he bothered. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was just boredom. The numbers on the ticket caught his eye immediately. For a moment, his brain refused to make sense of what he was seeing. He blinked, his hands tightening around the thin slip of paper as his eyes flicked between the numbers printed on the ticket and the winning numbers displayed on the printout taped to the wall behind the counter. His pulse quickened. Every number matched. The realization sent a jolt through his body. He forced himself to read the numbers again, checking each one, making sure he wasn't imagining things. But there was no mistake. The ticket was a winner. Not just a small payout, not the usual $5 or $10, but the jackpot. The kind of money that could change a person's life forever. His breathing slowed as another realization settled over him. Earl had thrown the ticket away. He hadn't checked it carefully, hadn't realized what he had done. He had simply sighed, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the trash bin as if it were worthless. Howard straightened up, gripping the ticket tightly. His mind raced through the implications. The rules were clear. Lottery winnings were determined by possession of the ticket, not by who had purchased it. Legally, whoever held the ticket could claim the prize. Earl had abandoned it. It no longer belonged to him. A slow, creeping thought made its way into Howard's mind. No one had seen him pick up the ticket. No one knew it existed. For a long moment, he stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the small piece of paper that could alter the course of his life. He could already picture what it would mean. An end to the long hours behind the register, the slow decay of the store, the ever-growing worry about bills. It could mean a fresh start, a new life. His heart pounded against his ribs as he made his decision. With steady hands, he carefully folded the ticket and slipped it into the pocket of his apron. The store remained quiet, The hum of the refrigerators and the occasional passing car outside the only sounds breaking the silence. Howard took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and turned back toward the counter. His face remained neutral, his movements steady, as if nothing had happened. He waited for the next customer to walk through the door, carrying on as if this were just another ordinary day. But deep down, he knew nothing would ever be ordinary again. The winning ticket remained in Howard Wilkes' pocket for the rest of the day, folded neatly inside his apron as he moved through his usual routine. Every so often, his fingers brushed against the thin paper, a quiet reminder of the decision he had made. The store continued its slow, uneventful rhythm, customers coming and going, unaware of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. By the time he locked up for the night, Howard's mind was racing with possibilities. He had spent decades behind that counter, watching his life inch forward without excitement, without risk. He had never been the kind of man who took chances, never strayed from routine. But now, fate had placed something unexpected in his hands. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. Earl had discarded the ticket, thrown it away without checking, and walked out of the store. It wasn't theft, it was carelessness, and Howard had simply been in the right place at the right time. At home, he sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the ticket placed carefully in front of him on the worn wooden table. The lottery website was open on his laptop, the winning numbers displayed in bold print. He checked them again, though he no longer needed to. He knew them by heart now, the sequence burned into his mind. The jackpot was staggering, millions of dollars. More money than he had ever dared to dream about. But a claim like this would bring attention. The state lottery office would scrutinize everything. Reporters would ask questions. The town would buzz with speculation. He needed a plan. He couldn't simply walk into an office and hand over the ticket without preparing for what came next. The next morning, he arrived at the store earlier than usual, unlocking the door before dawn. The world outside was still dark, the streets quiet. He stood behind the counter, staring at the rows of lottery tickets hanging neatly in their display case. Dozens of people bought them every day, hopeful for a stroke of luck. But luck had never worked like that. It wasn't about who deserved to win. It was about who recognized opportunity when it appeared. Earl Patterson shuffled in at his usual time, his heavy boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. Howard forced himself to act normally, greeting him as always, handing over the same cup of coffee he had every morning. Earl bought his tickets, scratched them with the same quiet determination, and tossed them into the trash without ceremony before walking out the door. Howard watched him leave, his mind filled with the weight of what he knew. The man had no idea he had thrown away a fortune, no idea that his life could have changed with a little more attention to detail. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Howard handled the usual customers, rang up gas and groceries, and forced himself to keep his hands steady. But beneath the surface, he was already planning. He needed to wait. Rushing to claim the prize would attract suspicion, and the last thing he needed was questions about where the ticket had come from. If he waited a little longer, the connection to the store would fade. By the afternoon, Howard made his decision. He would leave town, at least for a little while. A man suddenly coming into millions was bound to cause a stir, but if he were elsewhere when he claimed the prize, it would lessen the scrutiny. He told himself it was the smart move. Practical. A necessary precaution. As the sun dipped lower, he closed the store early, flipping the sign on the door before locking up. The town stretched before him, quiet and unassuming, the way it had always been. But he knew everything was about to change. That night, Howard packed a small bag. He didn't need much, just enough to get him where he needed to go. The ticket remained tucked inside a small envelope, hidden within the lining of his coat. He wasn't going to risk losing it now. By dawn, he was on the road. The town faded behind him, and with it, the life he had known. The gas station, the worn-out counter, the endless monotony of routine. It was all in the past now. Ahead of him lay something new, something uncertain. For the first time in his life, Howard Wilkes wasn't following a routine. He was taking a risk. And no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. The road stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar, as Howard Wilkes drove west. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic passing of mile markers were the only sounds accompanying him as he put distance between himself and the life he had left behind. The small envelope containing the lottery ticket remained secure in the lining of his coat, pressed against his chest like a hidden heartbeat. He had checked it at least a dozen times since leaving town, each time unfolding the slip of paper with shaking hands, verifying that the numbers still matched. The reality of it all hadn't yet settled in. It felt impossible that something so small could hold so much weight. He had never left town before, not like this. His entire life had been spent within a 50-mile radius of Sam's Gas and Grocery, a world where he had known every street, every face, every predictable turn of events. The idea of disappearing, of starting over, had never crossed his mind. Now, it was all he could think about. His plan had been simple. Get out of town, wait for the initial frenzy over the unclaimed ticket to die down, then quietly step forward and claim the money. But as the miles stretched behind him, he realized how unprepared he truly was. He had chosen his destination carefully. Denver, a city large enough to disappear in, far enough from home to avoid suspicion. If anyone back in town noticed his absence, they would assume he had finally sold the store or taken a rare vacation. No one would suspect the truth. His name had never been in the news, and he had never drawn attention to himself. He could disappear for weeks, months even, and no one would question it. By the time he reached the city, the sun had already dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the streets. The towering buildings, the rush of people, the neon glow of storefronts. It was overwhelming. He hadn't been in a place like this in years. He found a motel on the outskirts, cheap but anonymous, and paid in cash. No credit cards, no paper trail. He would be cautious. Inside the room, he spread out the documents he had gathered. He had spent the past few nights researching, reading about how lottery winners were tracked, how sudden wealth attracted attention, how even the most careful claims could raise suspicions. The key was patience. The longer he waited, the less anyone would connect him to the store where the ticket had been purchased. Days passed in a blur of careful planning. He moved between different motels, never staying in one place for too long. He avoided any habits that might make him memorable. He changed his clothes often, kept his head down, and paid attention to every face he saw. Paranoia crept in, slow and insidious. He wasn't running from the law, but he felt like a fugitive. The news reports confirmed what he already knew. The winning ticket remained unclaimed. The state lottery officials had issued statements urging the winner to come forward. Reporters speculated about the possibilities. Had the winner lost the ticket? Had they forgotten to check their numbers? Had they even realized they had one? The prize money sat in limbo, waiting for someone to step up. Howard knew they wouldn't wait forever. There was a deadline. If the ticket went unclaimed for too long, the money would be forfeited. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, but in truth, doubt had begun to creep in. Back in town, life at Sam's Gas and Grocery carried on. The regulars still gathered in the mornings, pouring coffee into paper cups, scratching away at their tickets. Earl Patterson still showed up, still played, still lost. He had no idea that his routine had nearly led him to millions. No idea that the man who had handed him his coffee every morning now carried the very fortune he had thrown away. The thought nagged at Howard in a way he hadn't expected. He had justified everything to himself. Earl had tossed the ticket away. That made it fair. That made it right. But then, why did he keep thinking about it? He had expected to feel relief once he left town, but the feeling never came. Instead, a new kind of tension settled into his bones, a quiet, persistent worry. He had changed his location, but not his mind. He caught himself thinking about the store, the town, the familiar faces that no longer surrounded him. It wasn't guilt, at least, he didn't think it was. It was something else, something he couldn't name. The city around him became a maze of unfamiliar streets and unfamiliar people. He stayed in cheap motels, ate in diners where no one asked questions, and tried to ignore the weight of the ticket burning in his pocket. But the longer he waited, the more uncertain he became. Then, on a cool afternoon in a small coffee shop tucked away in a quiet part of the city, Howard saw something that stopped him cold. A news segment was playing on the television above the counter, the volume low but clear enough for him to catch pieces of the report. The headline crawled across the screen. Mystery surrounds unclaimed lottery jackpot. Store owner vanishes after ticket sold. Howard's breath stalled in his chest. The reporter spoke about his sudden disappearance. People in town had noticed. The regulars at his store had commented on his absence. Someone had started asking questions. A man had been looking for him. The tension that had followed him since the moment he left town hardened into something sharper. Someone knew. Someone had put the pieces together. Howard turned away from the screen, gripping the edges of the table to keep his hands from shaking. He had thought he had left his old life behind. He had been wrong. Howard Wilkes left the coffee shop in a hurry, the news broadcast replaying over and over in his mind. He turned down a side street, his steps quick but deliberate, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder. The city had once felt like a place to disappear, but now, every face in the crowd seemed like someone who might recognize him. Someone had noticed his absence. Someone had connected it to the unclaimed lottery ticket. For the first time since leaving town, the weight of his decision felt unbearable. He had spent his entire life avoiding risk, living within the predictable boundaries of routine. He had convinced himself that taking the ticket had been a logical choice, an opportunity rather than a theft. But now, he wasn't so sure. If it had been the right choice, why did it feel so much like running? Back in his motel room, Howard locked the door and sat on the bed, pulling the envelope from his coat. The ticket was still there, folded neatly, its numbers unchanged. The promise of millions remained, but the thrill of possibility had faded into something else. Regret? Fear? Or just exhaustion? He wasn't sure anymore. He turned on the television and flipped through the channels until he found another news report. The screen showed footage of his store, Sam's Gas and Grocery, looking exactly as it had when he left. The newscaster's voice carried the same careful speculation as before, talking about a missing store owner, an unclaimed jackpot, and the growing suspicion that the two were linked. The longer he watched, the worse it became. Customers from his store were interviewed, their faces familiar. They spoke about his sudden disappearance, about how he wasn't the type to just up and leave. Some shrugged it off as coincidence, but others weren't so sure. Someone had been asking about him. Someone had started digging. Howard turned off the TV, the silence in the room pressing in around him. His fingers tightened around the ticket. The plan had been simple: get out of town, lay low, wait for the right time to claim the money. But now, time wasn't on his side. The longer he waited, the more suspicious his absence became. He needed to leave. Again. The motel was paid for in cash, so there was no official record of him being there. He gathered his things quickly, shoving his few belongings into a bag. He still had enough cash to keep moving, to find another city, another motel. But how far could he go before the truth caught up with him? At a gas station outside the city, he picked up a newspaper. His hands felt clammy as he unfolded it, scanning the pages until he found the article. His name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. The details were all there. The missing store owner. The unclaimed lottery prize. The way he had left town just as the winning numbers were announced. Someone was putting the pieces together. For the first time, he considered the worst-case scenario. If someone truly believed he had the winning ticket, would they come looking for him? Would they assume he had stolen it? What if someone claimed he had taken it from the store illegally? A ticket like this, millions of dollars at stake, wasn't just a forgotten piece of paper. It was enough to make people desperate, enough to turn suspicion into something dangerous. Howard's hands shook as he folded the newspaper and tossed it into the trash. His mind reeled with options. He could leave the country. He could buy a fake identity. He could vanish completely. But was that really a life worth living? Hiding forever, always looking over his shoulder? He got back in his car and drove, but instead of heading further away, he found himself retracing old roads. The highway signs became familiar again. The landscape shifted from wide-open highways to the narrow two-lane roads that led home. He hadn't meant to come back, not yet, maybe not ever. By the time he reached town, night had fallen. The streets were quiet, the neon glow of Sam's Gas and Grocery still flickering weakly over the parking lot. He pulled into the lot and sat there, staring at the building. It looked exactly the same, as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had changed. He thought about Earl Patterson. The old man had probably come in every morning, just as he always had, buying his coffee and his lottery tickets, never realizing how close he had come to escaping the life he had resigned himself to. Earl had thrown that ticket away without a second thought. But did that mean it hadn't belonged to him? Howard sat in his car for a long time, staring at the store, the ticket still tucked inside his coat. By morning, his decision was made. As the first hints of dawn stretched across the sky, Earl Patterson opened his front door to find an envelope taped outside. Inside was the lottery ticket he had unknowingly thrown away, along with a note written in shaky, deliberate handwriting. No explanation, no signature, just one sentence. This was always yours. Later that day, the news broke that the missing jackpot winner had finally come forward. Earl Patterson had cashed in the ticket, bewildered but undeniably lucky. The reporters called it a miracle, a second chance handed to a man who had spent his life struggling. No one questioned it. No one ever asked where the ticket had been in the days between its purchase and its redemption. By then, Howard Wilkes was already gone. He had left town without a word, his old life abandoned, his store left behind. He didn't need the money anymore. He didn't need to explain himself. He had won something far more valuable than a jackpot. He had walked away free.